Guys, craft of writing. We know that there's up to two parts: composition and reflection. Composition and reflection. And here's the main thing I want to show you. You need an imaginative, a persuasive, and a discursive, right? You probably only have one of those right now. Who has just one of the imaginative, persuasive, discursive forms prepared right now? A lot of people. Okay, that's fine. We need to do something about that, right? Though we want to make sure that you have that base one that maybe is your preference, or maybe it's the one you had to do for an assessment or something like that. And you want to make a variation for each one, right? So what you do, have a look at this. This is the slide that we'll kind of really just focus on now. You want to make a core draft. You want to make a core draft, and that can be based on the text type that you like. So if you like doing an imaginative, that will be your core draft. I've done an example as an imaginative in this diagram, but yours might be persuasive. Yours might be discursive. You guys might be asked a specific text type in the composition part. So it might say, create a persuasive composition. It might just say that. It might say, create either a discursive or persuasive. Or it might say, create a discursive, persuasive, or imaginative. And that's what everyone wants, don't they? Because you get a choice then. Everyone wants the choice. But we learned a couple of years ago in the HSC that they can ask for a specific type. They can say just imaginative. They can say just discursive. Therefore, to be prepared for the worst case scenario, you need to have some kind of version, some variation drafted for each text type here. So here's the first step though. Here's the first step. See the green box? You make your core draft. You need to have an extended version. I put 32 minutes. As you know, I'd probably go for more 30 minutes for module C. So you want to have a 30-minute, 20-mark response for your preferred text type. Okay, so I'm going to try and go through this slowly. Step one, create your first core draft. You probably all already have one based on assessments. You want to perfect that based on a certain question. And I'll give you guys a good question in a minute once I go through this process. But you want to have a core draft for each one. And you want to know that you have a 30-minute kind of version of that, right? Maybe it's less. Maybe it's 25 minutes. I wouldn't mind that. Okay, 25, 30 minutes. That's the one you'll use for a 20 marker if you get asked about that and if you get the perfect stimulus. If you don't get the perfect stimulus, you might have to adapt it. You then want to have a short version of that. So you have your core piece, you have an extended one, then you find an appropriate place in the composition that you could actually cut the rest off and you could just be left with the first part. So find an appropriate point in time that you could actually end your composition if only asked for a 10 or 12 mark question, even maybe 15 marks. Is that making sense so far? So you've got two versions. You've got a long version, and then you kind of know in your head that, oh, if I only get asked a 12 marker, instead of doing my 20 marker, because that will take too long, I'm going to end my composition here instead of here. So you have a different end point. You have an earlier end point for the short versions, which is probably quite likely. Very likely you get asked a 10 marker or a 12 marker. Could be 15, could be 20, but at least now you're prepared for that. You then need to create two variations. So you need to have a discursive variation and a persuasive variation. What I mean by a variation of the core one is that you should not change the core concern of the piece. This is the critical point. You should not change the core focus of the piece. So if you currently have a discursive and you're exploring, actually, we'll get an example. Could someone tell me like what the concern of their piece is right now? What are they exploring? What idea are you exploring? Should be, yeah.
Who is a leader?
Who is a leader? Now, is that closely related to what the prescribed text is about?
Yeah, like she was Linda Burney.
Yeah, and it's a similar concern, like you're writing about a similar thing.
Well, I don't know.
I would suggest going back, guys, and making sure that you've got a similar focus to the prescribed text that you're basing your style on. Okay,
do you mean do you mean like our novels, so like example like Artist of a Floating World, stuff like that?
Not Artist. I mean your module C. Yep. Module C.
That's Spotty Handed Villain.
Exactly. So if you're doing spotty-handed villainesses and there's a particular style there, you should be emulating the style, but you should also be making sure that what you're talking about is something quite similar. Why do I say that? Because some of the questions you can get actually will require you to offer a similar or different perspective to what the prescribed text was about. So it's not just telling you to use some of the language features like, oh, use first person or use an extended metaphor. It's saying you actually need to recreate a moment from the text. You guys understand? So it's better if your draft is closely connected with what the prescribed text in module C was about. That's the key point. Okay.
So do you only focus on one text that you chose?
Yes, good question. Yeah, I focus on one prescribed text. Even though you were required to study at least two, I focus on one and I use those same stylistic elements in all of the versions. So if I'm doing a discursive or an imaginative or a persuasive, if I'm focusing on a particular stylistic element like an extended metaphor or an anecdote, I'm going to use them. I'm going to use that same thing in all of them. Right. And I'm also, yeah.
Sorry, isn't that hard for persuasive? Because persuasive is much more like you have to have an argument.
So when you convert it into a persuasive, you can still have an anecdote, for instance. You can still have short syntax. You can still have a lot of the language features that you might be using in the other ones. You need to also have things that are to do with a persuasive. So if you guys see this table here, see the persuasive column, you need to use more rhetorical questions. You need to use repetition. You need to use high modality. Like if someone's trying to persuade you of something, you're probably going to say, you must do this, or you should do this. Or this has always been the case. So you would use that kind of language, but you can still be talking about the same thing that you were exploring in the discursive. Your tonality is different, isn't it? If you're trying to persuade someone versus contemplating something or reflecting on something in a discursive, the tone's changed, the style has changed, but you can still have a lot of overlapping elements. All right. So you need to kind of update the tone. You need to modify the tone and the structure a little bit, but you should still be ultimately talking about the same thing in all three types. So in all three of those drafts, I would still have the same concern. For instance, if I have a persuasive about, what makes a good leader, or that like all leaders are corrupt, maybe I'm making that argument, right? Then my discursive would also be about the same thing. And I'm going to be able to preserve a lot of my persuasive elements. I'm just going to have to change the tonality to make it a little bit more reflective. Okay. So the discursive is going to still be about leaders and whether we have good leaders or not. It's just not going to be like kind of forcing the argument upon the reader as much. And then with the imaginative, my story is going to be about someone who's writing about a leader, or they themselves were a leader and they're doubting their leadership. And it's going to still cover the same ideas. So I would have that consistent concern there. What is the best way to adapt the discursive into an imaginative? So if you have a discursive, Judah, do you want to, I don't know if your mic's working, if you just want to speak it out, it's a bit easier. What's your discursive currently about? Judah, if you're able to answer that, just so I can help you as an example. What is the best way to adapt student life and the passage of time, procrastination? So first of all, make sure that what you're talking about there is closely connected with the concern or theme of the prescribed text. That was the first thing. I don't really know what you mean by student life. Like, what are you actually exploring there? Like, is there an idea behind that? Because they're just like buzzwords to me again. Like, what are you actually saying? What are you suggesting? Procrastination. Like, what does that mean? What are you suggesting? So make sure you've got a clear concept to begin with, not just like I'm exploring student life. Like, again, that's like Shakespeare explores power. I don't really know what that means. Rose, it just said you raised your hand. Do you have like a question or something to suggest?
No, sorry, it was an accident.
Oh, all good. Yep.
If you get a question and it was in paper 2, and you get a question about like write a discursive that explores memories, but then it says like you have to make reference to like George Orwell's 1984 or like T.S. Eliot, then is that combining like the different modules?
Yeah, that's something I would practice later on. I think you want to get these core drafts done first. And Judah, I'm going to come back to your point in a second. But Gloria, so that the last thing I would focus on as part of this process is, what if they wanted me to include a character from my module A text? Or the main focus is your module C text, because they're the prescribed text. So don't get carried away with, Elliot and like your module A and common mod text. Module C is its own module. It has its own texts. So let's focus on that. And then when you do some practice of different types of questions, you can throw in, oh, what if I had to use a character from mod A? Who would the character be that allows me to just weave it in where I don't have to change that much? Who's the easiest person to use there? So you can actually have a look at those questions at the end and always try and make life easier for yourself by choosing things that allow you to preserve more of your draft than otherwise. Okay. So that's what I would do with last, but I would really focus just on getting the core drafts. How do you adapt a discursive into an imaginative? You have to create a setting and a character that embodies the same kind of concerns as the discursive. So if you're doing a discursive about procrastination, then instead of just reflecting on procrastination, you need to actually have a character who you characterize at the beginning, who is in the midst of procrastination and they can't get out of it. So if you're talking about procrastination, make sure that instead of reflecting on it, you actually show a character who is that person procrastinating, which means you need to design a setting. You need to create a setting. That's the first thing that you guys all need to know. If you're going to shift to an imaginative from one of the other two, create a setting and a character that then allows you to explore the same concerns as in that discursive and persuasive. So again, if it's procrastination, I can talk about procrastination and reflect on some things, or I can design a setting where maybe my character's at a desk trying to write. It's always good to write about someone writing, because that's so relevant to the craft of writing, right? So if you write about a writer, then you can actually write about your writer in a room procrastinating and explore all of the same concepts, but you're creating more imagery. It's more descriptive. Judah, as you'll see on this slide, the imaginative is far more descriptive. You have vivid imagery. You might have some dialogue, but I wouldn't really recommend having too much dialogue, guys, because it's very hard to do that well. And it often is very tacky and cliche. So I would just, in medias res, you can start in the middle of action. So Judah, if you're starting with the procrastination thing, jump straight into the conflict. Don't waste time. Make it clear what the problem is for your character, and that it will allow you to explore through your setting and through their actions as they try to write something, how difficult it is to not procrastinate, which is the same thing you explored in your discursive. It's just a different style. There's more to go through on this. I'm sorry, but obviously we're short on time here. I've got to go. So basically, we're going to be looking at this in a much more thorough way with examples and actually doing adaptations, and you can see all of the different translations. Going to be doing that tomorrow if you guys want to see that further. Otherwise, if you've got any other questions, then and stimulus adaptation, I'm going to cover tomorrow as well in a lot of depth, going through that.